Hello, and welcome to this afternoon's National Principals Month webinar on the challenges and successes of principal recruitment and retention. This is a jointly sponsored webinar between AACTE, NAESP, and UCEA. My name is Honor Feedy, and I'm the Professional Learning Coordinator here at NAESP, and I'll be supporting our panel today. I would encourage you all as you come into the room to please use your chat box on your webinar panel to write in any questions or comments as we go through the session today. I would like to welcome our moderator for today, Caitlin Wilson, who's the Director of Program Improvement and Practice at the American Association for Colleges and Teacher Education. Caitlin, welcome.
Thanks, Honor. Thanks for having us. As Honor said, I'm Caitlin Wilson with AACTE, and as she mentioned, NAESP and AACTE work in partnership with the Wallace Foundation on school leadership initiatives, of which principal recruitment and retention is an important focus. So we thought a great way to kick off National Principals Month is with this webinar focused on diving more deeply into issues related both around principal recruitment and retention. So with that, we have three wonderful speakers lined up to share their experiences with you. So first we'll have Jamon Flowers, who is currently an education policy planning and leadership doctoral student at the University of William & Mary, and he is a former school leader and also started his career as a teacher. So we'll be excited to hear about his experiences. Then we'll hear from David Wick, who currently serves as NAESP's president, and he is the principal of Columbia Falls Junior High School in Montana. And then last but certainly not least, we'll hear from Dr. Ed Fuller, who is an associate professor in the Department of Education Policy Studies in the College of Education at Penn State University. Dr. Fuller is also the associate director for policy and advocacy at the University Council for Educational Administrators. So I'm really excited to dig into the conversation and hear what our three speakers have to say. But before we do that, I want to dive into the objectives and goals for our webinar. We all know that there's a vital role that school leaders play in shaping the school culture and their effect on student achievement and teacher retention. So therefore, recruitment and retention of principals is a critical activity for both principal preparation programs, who is more of our AACTE membership, and school districts, right, more broadly. So today, that's why we've partnered together to bring you this webinar to highlight both the latest research in recruiting and retaining quality principals. We will turn to these current and former principals and researchers to share their experiences both from the higher education setting and the K-12 setting, and to share their research on what attracts principals to the role of being a school leader and what keeps them in that position. So we'll discuss some factors contributing to principal turnover, the impact of principal turnover, and the recommendations for both principal preparation and professional development support to reduce that turnover rate. So before we get started, I want to start with this poll to see kind of who we have joining us for the webinar today and who will be a part of the conversation. This will help us get to know a little bit more about who is in the audience and who we're speaking to. So if you could take a moment to respond to this poll, it should be popping up on your screen now. And we're just asking, what's your current role? Are you an elementary principal, a middle school principal, a secondary principal? Are you district staff, higher education faculty, or other? Which feel free to use the chat box to type in your answer. So we'll give everyone a second to respond to the poll, and then we'll ask Honor to share the results of our poll today.
It looks like 50% of our audience put in other, and we'll visit that chat. And the chat was the educational consultant. And then 33% are higher education faculty, and then 17% are middle school principal.
Okay, great. Honor, thanks for sharing those results, and thank you guys for responding to our poll. That way we just have a little bit of background on who you guys are. All right, so last thing before I turn it over to our speakers. I want to tell you a little bit about the Wallace Foundation's Principal Pipeline Initiative. So I'm not sure if you all have heard about it, but just a brief preview of what's there, and I'll tell you where to find some resources, and then we'll move on. So the Wallace Foundation awarded 6 urban school districts between $7.5 and $12.5 million, and you can see the list of those districts here on the screen. And so each district was expected to align their pre-service preparation, their selective hiring and placement practices, and evaluation and support with school leadership standards. The districts were also expected to create systems of support that would sustain these efforts after the grant ended. So earlier this year, I believe it was back in April, the Wallace Foundation released a report and showing the results of this work after 3 years. So after 3 years, these districts saw a notable, statistically significant benefit for student achievement based on their work around the principal pipeline. So they also saw an increase in principal retention based on that work. So just wanted to share a little bit about that and tell you where to access more information on this report. So if you go to the Wallace Foundation website, they have a knowledge center with a page focused on school leadership, and you can look for a copy of the report, which is titled A Feasible, Affordable, and Effective Way for Districts to Improve Schools. And you'll be able to dig into the findings of that report and additional resources from the Wallace Foundation on their website. So I don't want to delay any longer, and I want to hand it over to Jamon Flowers to share a little bit more about his experiences as a principal and kind of what helped him become interested in being a principal and what helped him stay. Jamon shared with me that he was a principal for 10 years, which is very impressive. So I'll be eager to hear what made you stay in that role for so long. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jamon.
Thank you, Caitlin. Again, good afternoon to all. My name is Jamon Flowers. I am currently a doctoral student at the College of William and Mary with a research interest in the principalship as well as rural education. Prior to becoming a full-time doc student, I served in multiple roles in K-12, from being a teacher, instructional coach, assistant principal, then principal was my last assignment. And Caitlin asked a very interesting question: what kept me in administration for those number of years? I have to back up just a moment and talk a little bit about what got me into administration. I think it was just more of a little bit of discontent about certain circumstances and about the narrative in education, and that I wanted to be more of a solution versus, I'm not going to say I was a problem, but I wanted to find ways to better the narrative of education for all students, but in particularly for the teachers as well as principals. So I began to think about how I could make a major difference, and after being an instructional coach for a short period of time, for 3 years, I expressed interest in administration and was tapped, if you will, to go into administration at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. And I think each level brought a difference of experience as well as complexities, but a great deal of enjoyment. And I think this is a great way to kick off the appreciation and celebration of principals as we discuss, challenges as well as successes of recruiting and retaining effective principals, not just principals, but effective principals. And I basically looked at, if you would go to the next slide, about where are the principals currently, and thanks to the National Center of Educational Statistics, who just published this information about where are the principals, where are they going, and as we look at it distributed through as basis race, where can we find most of our principals? And what are they doing and what type of locale? And my interest is rural education, but majority of my career has been in urban cities and urban settings as well. I think it's very interesting to see where the principals are, who are leading these schools, but also what keeps them there at those particular schools. And if you go to the next slide, some of the things that they talk about, the reason why we have a high principal turnover rate is the working conditions. Now, I was fortunate enough to endure some of the toxic working conditions and some of the places that I was in, but at the same time, I was fortunate enough to have superintendents and area superintendents and leaders in general that supported my professional development. And as you can see, that some principals don't get that particular development. And when I say development, whether it is personalized, individualized, or is it more contextualized, just professional development, period. But also having the autonomy to make decisions within their own school building is another reason why some principals leave. I've been fortunate to have both experiences where I had a little bit limited amount of autonomy, but then I've also been in places where I had a lot of autonomy to make some decisions. And it was a different as day and night when we can make these decisions, how we can make these decisions, and keeping the focus. Also, if you look at the third column, it talks about setting the discipline policy, about principals having, again, this autonomy to set the policy as it relates to discipline. One size doesn't fit all. And I think that's one of the things that we need to continue to ingrain in our future leaders as well as our practicing leaders, is that, you know, we have these district policies and district expectations, but then what is going to work best for your teachers, what is going to work best for your students, and you have to sometimes make that type of decision. And part of being a principal is being an advocate for your school. And if you're not that type of a person, then sometimes I think you have to revisit your why. And then last but not least, I think in the third comment is talking about deciding the different types of professions, as long as I can't see that on my screen, but for their schools and things like that. Again, it's all about decision making and about who has that power and who has that ability. I think what keeps some of our most effective principals going, and it's what kept me going. Even when I was told no, I can say that now, not as a practicing principal, I found ways to find the right answer because I felt like it was in the best interest of my students and to get around some of those policies that hindered and limited the progress. And then you ask the question, well, what keeps us here and how can we recruit more people? And if we go to the third slide, I always go back to the 3 R's, you know, and the first R that I talk about is re-recruiting. And that for me, basically recruit and re-recruit who you have, who's already serving as a principal within your district. And this is definitely for our district leaders, but also show an appreciation for them. It's not easy being a principal. I don't care if you're in an affluent school or in a Title I school. You know, it is not easy at all being a principal. So sometimes we need to be re-recruited, especially at those long days and those tedious moments and those intense moments where everything that we learned in school goes out the door, and we have to figure out what is in the best interest of the students and things like that. So we cannot forget about who we already have in this particular domain and show an appreciation. And it's more than just October for Principals Month. I think it needs to be ongoing and consistent. The next thing I would like to remind is just how we recruit and being very strategic and very purposeful. Later on in my career as an administrator, I had this revelation and this epiphany is that, you know what, I may not be the most effective principal at every school that my superintendent wants me to lead. And you have to know yourself. And when I say when you're very strategic in your recruiting, know what and who you're recruiting. Know what schools need certain things and know the needs of the schools. And you can find that out through the community as well as the teachers and the students. But just do not be recruiting just to recruit. And I think that goes back to say that we are in a time frame where the campaign to recruit principals, and I wouldn't even say effective principals, just recruiting principal is on the ground and running, but we still need to be very strategic if we're trying to change the narrative in education, because part of that narration is making sure that we have the right principals, the right leaders in the right spot. And oftentimes, I think earlier we talked about the pipeline is looking a little bit dry. It's going to continue to look dry as we look at principals because our teaching pipeline is not as full as we would like. I would like to say that in the same spirit of that, sometimes, you know, when we find these effective people and find effective teachers, don't always expect them to go into principalship. And especially when we on this campaign to get more people of color to join administration as well as teaching, sometimes when we have these people, we need to figure out if they really want to be in administration. Just because they're good with discipline doesn't mean they're going to be great at leading or they want to lead the classroom. So we really have to understand, and also that, you know, urban, rural, as well as suburban, those are 3 different contexts that need 3 different principals. And even within the same, you know, the locales, each school needs someone different. I always say, and especially on this domain, is that we cannot continue to try to solve rural problems with urban solutions. So we have to find the right people, the right leaders, in order to make sure that we show progress that we need, and that's in the best interest. And the last piece is about how do we retain effective principals. I always say, what are we offering our principals? You know, we have developed teachers to death. And every time we turn around, we have professional development for teachers, and there's a new program coming out, an initiative with fatigue. But there are times as administrator, I wish that I received more professional development. And it's more than just being able to go to conferences and things of that nature, but what is the district offering these principals in order to that motivation to sustain that energy that it takes? I think the hardest administration job I had was in the elementary level. I never in my days figured out that it was going to be that difficult and that much energy. But what do we need and what do our principals need? We talk about individualized educational plans, but I think in order to retain some of the most effective principals, we need to make sure that we have a plan for each of our principals. And I say we're looking at the district level, but also in order to retain, we have to look at some of our preparation programs. It is more than just skimming over the latest fad in education, but I think it's also really digging down to understanding what it means to lead. It's more than just understanding the leadership approaches. What does it mean to lead a school that needs specific type of ordeals? What does it mean to lead a Title I school? What does it mean to lead an affluent school? Because with some of these labels come negative connotations, and it's going to take a different type of leader to do that. So providing them with the necessary skills and ongoing development, not just for the teachers, but for your principals, because oftentimes there were days I used to leave the job empty. I had nothing else to give. And that impacted my family, and that impacted, other things. And, some people don't have the means to even go back to school to get more education or to get some of these credits. So I think we have to look closely at how we structure development, but also how we support our principals. And that varied from the non-experience to the experience, and how we even, build the capacity of some of our stronger principals and some of our strongest principals in moving things forward. So I'm excited about this whole conversation and about the challenges and successes and how we need to go beyond the four walls to recruit the right people. But we have to understand what we're looking for first. So I'm going to stop there because I can keep going, Caitlin.
Great, thank you. All right, with that, I'm going to move it on to our next speaker. So as I mentioned, David Wick is the president of NAESP and a current principal. So David, please share with us your experiences and a little bit more about your work at NAESP.
Great, thank you very much. Mr. Flowers, I really appreciated your information. There was a lot of great information that you shared there. A lot of it struck a chord with what I've been thinking, as well as our organization has been thinking. I've been a classroom teacher for 11 years. I have spent 3 years as an assistant principal and then 24 years as a principal of middle school. When Mr. Flowers was talking about working conditions and why people stay in a job, I guess I would comment a couple of things that he said really made a lot of sense to me. Those working conditions. One, we've had tremendous stability in our districts with only 2 superintendents in the entire time that I've worked there, as well as school board members who continue to work in our school district that hired me. So that stability is really important. It builds a level of trust. I have to say that in my job I've had tremendous autonomy, creativity. I've received great professional development, and so there's been a number of factors that have provided job satisfaction for me to remain not only a principal but to remain in the same district doing so, and really enjoy that. In fact, been missing it this year as I've taken on this new role as NASP president this year and traveling and representing principals throughout the country, which is a very humbling experience for me. So I'm a strong believer also in our professional organizations and what they bring to this topic in terms of recruiting and as well as retaining principals. I think it's important, played an important role in my career in a number of different ways. We have regional organization as well as state and national organization. All the things I've learned The collegiality with those other folks has been a very important part of my career. So most of what I'm going to talk about today actually is about NASP and what we do provide. I will say that I believe the most important thing about being a leader is, as Mr. Flowers said, not the programs, but more the character traits of the leader and making sure they're a right fit for the particular school that someone's in. Just some quick information about NASP. It was founded in 1921, and yes, that means in 2021 we will be celebrating our 100th anniversary with our conference in Chicago, and serves educational leaders in the United States, Canada, and throughout the world. And the next slide talks about our mission, and that, as you see, there are two main roles. One is to lead in advocacy for the principalship, and we do that in a number of different ways, both locally, regionally, and nationwide, but also to support those elementary and middle level principals in their educational pursuits. And the vision of the organization on the next slide is, of course, that it's all about the individual child, the progress of the individual child, and that the principal plays a key role in doing that within the school. I've always felt that the teacher is the primary actor with the student, but the principal sets the tone of the school and assists the teachers in their role, and is very important to each student's success because of their more global view of the school. So the next slide starts with just some professional learning opportunities. We have a broad suite of those things that I'm going to be mentioning here in the next few minutes. So the next slide is shows a couple of the different things that we've been doing. On the left, you see a publication that we've just renewed. It's our Leading Learning Communities. It's fresh off the press. And it's a very practical guide for principals that are in the role at this point. It's the practices and the priorities, and it's been done by practitioners to help them to use that as a resource to see what other principals are doing and what the experts in the field are saying about what effective principals do. We have a National Mentor Training and Certification Program, which of course supports the new principal with a mentor. It's a highly structured professional learning program that looks at best practices and provides that network of support for school leaders. It's a 2-day intensive training to begin with, and then serves as a 9-month process for them to get that mentor certification. We started a new venture this last year with our superintendent's organization, AASA, the National Aspiring Principals Academy, and that is for people who are looking to advance to the next level of leadership. It's a year-long cohort that we think is going to be a very successful program for those aspiring principals. Go to the next slide. You see several other things that we're involved with. The Pre-K3 Leadership Academy, which is a blended learning experience. It's cohort-based. It's a year-long program. It's aligned to one of our publications, Leading Pre-K3 Learning Communities. It's been contracted in districts and states. NASP works with developing that program and helping people who are starting and working in those early learning environments. The Center for Innovative Leadership is an approach for us to look at the challenges of the 21st century. It disseminates those transformative practices that are done by principals. It's led by the two gentlemen you see in the picture there, Hamish Brewer and Andy Jacks, two young principals who are very innovative. They are practicing principals, award-winning principals. They've both been National Distinguished Principals for NASP. They do a fantastic job of providing young leaders and those of us who've been in the field for quite a while some new ideas. Hamish is known as the skateboarding principal. So there's a lot of different ideas that come out of the Center for Innovative Leadership. If you move to the next slide, a couple of other things that are there. The first one being the National Panel of New Principals, and you probably can't see that on your screen real well, but one of the things that they do is they provide information. They're first and second year members of NASP, and they answer survey questions and provide input for us. And then the new principal connection is put out to those folks that talks about what do you spend most of your time on? What are the biggest struggles that you have? What are some practices that you've used to be successful in your beginning of your career? So that's a really neat program I think we have going. Next slide talks about our Webinar Wednesdays, which is a monthly service that we provide our members, and we have focused those webinars in a lot of different ways. Of course, our regular principles. We've also focused some of our webinars on early career principles to help them with some topics that they have shared with us that they think are interesting and important. The assistant principals, which is kind of an overlooked role sometimes within our schools, and so we wanted to make sure we focus some of our attention on the assistant principals. And of course, aspiring principals, trying to recruit people to become principals and encourage them that this is a great profession to be in, which we all believe. And finally, we've also looked at women in pre-K leadership and those kinds of things that are really specific to those particular people. We have a professional learning advisory council that we use to help us. These are veteran principals who provide us with information that allows us to understand what are the issues that principals are having and what kinds of professional learning can we provide them as a bonus in terms of membership. We have state and international partnerships that we use to make sure that we provide information to those states and give them as much assistance as we can in professional development. A couple more things real quickly. Our conference this next year will be in Louisville, Kentucky. We just had our conference in Spokane, Washington this last summer. It's a phenomenal experience for our principals. It's a chance for them to learn, share, and gather information and network with colleagues. We think that's probably the most important thing, is networking with colleagues that are doing the same thing that we have, those personal relationships. So the organizational part of that we think is extremely important for our practicing principals. And the next slide talks about our publications that we have. I'll just go through those briefly. You see there's one on arts and education. There's 3 strategies for increasing arts. Leading pre-K3 learning communities, which I mentioned earlier, the pillars practices I mentioned earlier. You can see that one of our really important ones is the one on the bottom left, and that's building culturally responsive schools. That was done by our diversity task force. Some great information there, what best practices and research and strategies there are to being culturally responsive. You can see we've been a part of the pre-K8 survey, the 10-year study that's listed in the middle of that particular page. And then we also have a publication on after school and summer learning. So I think in conclusion, is there a couple more slides that are just professional learning, and the last slide, if we can go to that, is just my contact information. I want to mention one other publication really important is our Principal Magazine. It's an award-winning magazine that provides great information for our principals. And as you see at the bottom, we are very active on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So we have an opportunity to provide principals with the support in the profession. And like I said, we think the organization, the reason I spent so much time, is plays a very important role in not only recruiting, but in retaining principals. I thank all of you, and happy National Principals Month.
David, thank you. One thing I will comment on, thank you for sharing such a comprehensive overview of all the work from NAESP, and I know that you mentioned the networking piece is such an important part. AACTE's annual meeting was in Louisville earlier this year, and I can say the food there is amazing. So there's some great places to eat and to do some networking over dinner or lunch.
Thank you very much, Caitlin.
Okay, so next, and our final speaker for today is Dr. Ed Fuller, who I mentioned is Associate Professor at Penn State University, and he is the Associate Director of Policy and Advocacy for UCEA. So Dr. Fuller, if you could share as well about your experiences and some of your research as it relates to principal recruitment and retention.
Sorry, I lost my mouse cursor there and I couldn't unmute myself. Thank you very much, Caitlin, and thanks to AACTE and NAESP for the opportunity. I'd like to build upon the comments of Mr. Flowers and Mr. Witt, because I think they covered a lot of the issues So I was actually a high school teacher and went through a principal preparation program at University of Texas with the intention to become a principal, and then decided that that was not a good match to my skill set. And I think everybody is probably thankful that I didn't become a principal, because it's really probably the most difficult job in education, because you have pressures from all around you, from the bottom up and from the top down. And I always say principals are the meat in the sandwich. They get pressed from both sides. So it's a really difficult position. And at the age of 28, I certainly was not ready to take on the roles and responsibilities of a principal. But I now study a lot of the labor markets with principals and who becomes a principal. So I'll talk about that. We can go to the next slide. Before I start, one thing I want to make sure that everybody understands, and for those in NAESP, they certainly do, is principals are really critical to teacher effectiveness and retention and student outcomes. And while people in schools have known this for a long time, research really bears this out now. So principals are responsible for the organizational effectiveness and school climate. They've been shown to impact student achievement. They're the second most important school factor in terms of improving student outcomes. Principals improve teacher effectiveness, and they also increase teacher retention. Next slide, please. In terms of turnover, between 20 and 25% of principals leave their schools each and every year. So that is a lot of churn. That's much higher than teachers. And in fact, I think if more people knew of this turnover rate, it would be considered a national crisis, because the turnover is not equitably distributed across schools. High poverty schools and underfunded schools have higher principal turnover rates. Schools with lower accountability ratings tend to have higher turnover rates. And it turns out that initially people had found personal characteristics of the principals and student demographics influenced turnover. But both for teachers and principals now, we don't think that's really an issue so much. It's other things. It's things that are not associated with the person's characteristics, and it certainly doesn't seem to be the case that student demographics or even the percentage of kids living in poverty influence the turnover. It's the factors that happen to occur in schools and districts that serve those students. So turnover is a huge issue. Next slide, please. What are the causes of turnover? And then when we go to the working conditions slide, which we'll do in just a minute, I'll talk about recruitment as well. But potential causes for turnover are lower relative salaries are associated with turnover. So even when this in the same district or in urban areas and even in rural areas, if your salary is lower relative to other principals around you, you're much more likely to leave. And that's true for any job. That's not unique to principals. For state policy, unfair accountability measures and an extreme focus on testing has been linked with principal turnover. And with unfair accountability measures, particularly under No Child Left Behind, where it was just changes in % of students passing a test or % proficient, those are not accurate indicators of school quality in student outcomes or student growth. But a lot of districts and a lot of states use those misleading measures to decide whether to keep a principal or push a principal out. And that's still happening, and a lot of principals who are actually doing a good job can be pushed out based on inaccurate measures that districts or states are using. I still hear about district decisions to move all principals every X number of years. I used to get a lot more phone calls about this. I don't think it's happening as much, but some districts still say, well, we don't want the principals to get stale. We're going to move them every 3 years or 4 years or 5 years. That is probably the worst possible thing that a district can do, is to move everybody every X number of years. Frankly, if you can find a principal who's successful at a school, a district should do whatever it takes to keep that person at that school The research says if you move somebody to a different school, just because they're successful in one school doesn't mean they're going to be successful at the next. And this is what Mr. Flowers was talking about. Context matters. The specific issues in that school matter, and you need a good match between the principal and the school context. And if you can find a good one and that person's doing a great job, keep them there. Do whatever you can to keep them there. And then working conditions that both of the other presenters talked about, those are really huge. And so if we can go to the next slide, there's lots of different working conditions. So I'm obviously not going to go through all of these, but preparation programs influence them, the quality of the preparation somebody receives before they get into the field. And recent research, actually, surveys of principals say most of them feel well prepared. It turns out that white educators entering the principalship feel much less prepared to deal with students of color and students living in poverty than leaders of color. So that's a huge issue that we need to work on in terms of preparation program. We need to do a better job of preparing our white principals for entering schools serving lots of kids of color. And that's increasingly a lot of the schools. That brings me to a point too, is we need to do a better job tapping, like Mr. Flowers talked about, in recruiting educators of color, teachers of color into the pipeline of principals. Research has shown that leaders of color have really important outcomes for students of color. There's less inequitable disciplinary policies for students of color when you have a leader of color. Students of color are more likely to be in gifted ed. They're less likely to be suspended. They're less likely to be in special education when they shouldn't be. And they just have, students of color have overall better student outcomes when they have a leader of color. It turns out also that teachers of color have been shown to have really positive impacts for students of color, and teachers of color are more likely to be hired and more likely to stay when we have a leader of color in that school. So it's really critical that we work on that issue. State policy, again, testing and accountability can impact it. Mr. Wick talked about principal autonomy and how the district provides autonomy and budgeting and just decision-making authority to the principal. That's going to vary with how much years of experience the principal has. You don't want to dump everything on a beginning principal, but if they've shown they know how to handle things, then hey, give them some autonomy. District policy in terms of evaluation, educator recruitment and retention, and allocation of resources. One of the things that's really critical is particularly for principals in harder to staff schools, who gets to hire teachers first? And that's really important. And oftentimes newly hired principals get the teachers who are kind of left over, and they have a lot of new positions to fill, and that puts them, in a difficult spot. And they tend to start the year behind everybody else, and then it's just a kind of a declining spiral because the district hasn't created the conditions for that person to be successful. In school, context matters, but really one of the really important issues, and again, both of the other presenters talked about this, is that relationship with your superintendent or whoever your supervisor is. You need stability of that supervisor and the superintendent. You need lots of support, positive and constructive feedback from that person. And really there needs to be a relationship that's characterized by trust and respect. Michelle Young, who used to be executive director of UCA, and I did a survey of principals in Texas. We found that was one of the issues that really kept people in a school or drove people out is that relationship with their supervisor, and whether they felt it was characterized by trust and respect. When it was, they're willing to stay and do whatever they need to do. When that wasn't there, then they're much more likely to leave their school. So those are kind of the factors that influence the working conditions that influence principal retention. And then quickly, I'll talk about the last slide so we can go to questions. Here's some potential solutions, but we need a lot more research on solutions, both in terms of recruitment and retention. We need to improve preparation, who we select, provide more clinical experiences, provide more mentoring, and coaching seems to be a really promising strategy. We need to provide greater salaries, particularly for people who are willing to take on hard-to-staff schools in schools that are in more challenging situations. We need to provide ongoing coaching in professional development, provide the appropriate autonomy in sport. And then again, attention to principal-supervisor relationships. At the state level, we need to make sure that accountability systems are fair and aren't disadvantaging principals of certain types of schools. And last, we need funding fairness and adequacy. A lot of, in particular, a lot of leaders of color will take on jobs in schools that are underfunded, and those schools often just don't have the resources to be successful, and then those principals get pushed out because they're deemed not as successful, when in fact we just put them in a position where it was almost impossible to be successful. Along with those potential solutions, again, recruiting leaders of color and women in the high school positions, they still are disproportionately in PK8, and keeping those individuals in the field. I will stop there, and so we have time for questions.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Ed. So we do have some questions that have already been submitted in the chat box, so I'm going to kind of read them out, I think in the order that we received them, and we'll see if you guys have some insights to share. So the first question is, do you see the RELAY graduate school education program? This is the National Principal Academy Fellowship Program. So do you see that as a step in the right direction for professional development for principals? And I think my understanding and knowledge of this program is it's a one-year fellowship program for either principals or aspiring, I believe it's supervisors, principal supervisors. So do you all see this as a step in the right direction as professional development for principals? And Ed, if you have an answer, or whoever has a thought on this wants to jump in. I'm not sure how familiar you all are with this program.
I'm unfamiliar with it, so I don't really feel able to comment at this time.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with it either. I'm interested in the idea of a year-long program. I think we have teachers do student teaching, but we have a harder time having principals get some experience in the field before they begin. They might have the degree and then they just go right into the principalship without having either the proper mentoring or any field experiences. So if that's what it provides, it sounds like it would be a good start.
Caitlin, I'm not familiar with the program either, so I can't comment on that one.
Okay. Well, the next question is kind of two parts. So since teacher and principal are two very different jobs, why is the natural inclination for a teacher to transition to becoming a principal? And then the second part of that question, do you see a day where principals and teachers receive different training at the undergraduate level and beyond? So I'm wondering if you all, from your experience or from your research, have seen anything on why it's natural for teachers to move into the principal role as the next step kind of in their career trajectory.
I think part of it, and this is just based off of my experiences, Caitlin, I think going from a teacher to instructional coach or to administration, it sounds like the correct steps, because in my head, as I put my teacher hat back on and thinking about being a principal, who one of our hats that we have to wear is being an instructional leader, I think trying to have that relationship and have that understanding of what it's like to be a teacher. As the old cliche say, you can't lead what you don't understand. And I like to say to a certain degree, on that because you always don't necessarily have to have a total understanding of it. But I think going from a teacher is like to an administration is somewhat like of a stepping stone, because you have to understand some of the complexities within the classroom in order to lead or to even give suggestions or to even help a teaching staff in order to meet the needs of the students. So in my head, I'm thinking that is very natural. It has come in handy in all the years of experience, when I'm having conversations with teachers and giving them suggestions, but also praising them for some excellent work. So I have to be able to recognize those things. And in my training as a principal, that wasn't always an automatic. So some of my training as a principal came with on-the-job training. I had a lot of books and theory behind my training, but when I learned how to be a principal and yet even a teacher, it became more of what I learned on the ground, if that makes sense. So for me, it makes perfect sense to be in mind, like, okay, I was once a teacher, right, the subject area, the grade level, but I can have somewhat of a relationship where I can somewhat relate to you, although I'm a principal now, in order to give you some suggestions.
I would agree. I think with everything Mr. Flowers said, I use the example of I've been a middle school and high school teacher and a middle school administrator, and I have a really great admiration for our primary principals as well as our primary teachers. I feel like that's an area that I don't understand very well. I watch the amazing work that they do. I think it would be very hard for me to give them a lot of instructional advice, never having done it. So I would agree that it's very difficult. Even though they're very different jobs, they are very entwined together. So, there's been some attempts to, look at, can a business leader go into a school and make this happen? And as far as I can see, not a lot of success with that. Part of that has to do with not having had that experience of being in the classroom. I also would agree with Mr. Flowers that a lot of what we learn is when we're on the ground. I've laughed for a long time about a theory that I learned in graduate school called management by walking around. I thought it was ridiculous when I saw it. However, I have found it to be one of the most important theories, because in practice, that's where you learn what's happening. You learn who the students are, you learn what the teachers are doing, you're able to daily see what the classroom environment looks like, and then you're able to give feedback, mostly positive, of all the things you're seeing, so you're not walking in just to do an observation. And that has been one of the keys to our success, I think, is becoming collegial in the fact that they're used to seeing the administrator in and out of the classroom. So that's where we learn a tremendous amount. And back to not being a teacher ahead of time, one of the things I think is a weakness is our teachers don't always see what's happening in other classrooms. They're kind of isolated. So we are always trying to seek ways through professional learning communities and different ways for people to see each other's perspective is always effective in helping their growth. So that would be my response.
Great. Caitlin, can I step in here and ask a question of the panel?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
Here's a tough question, folks. What would be one piece of advice you would give for both districts and principal prep programs on recruiting new principals?
I'll attempt to answer that. One is for principal preparation programs, casting a wide net, but being pretty selective on who you let into your program. And that doesn't necessarily mean, we're only going to let 50% of the applicants in or anything like that. But, looking to see if people have shown some leadership abilities as a teacher, looking to see what kind of schools they've worked in. Are they relatively effective at instruction? Because as the other two presenters have mentioned, that's an important skill or knowledge to have as a principal. It's important because they're going to work with teachers. In terms of of districts, I think there's a couple of things, because I don't think there's ever one thing. I'm going to stray a little bit. One is to try to recruit earlier. Oftentimes people recruit too late, and that's particularly true of schools serving kids of color and kids living in poverty. They tend to be the last schools to get a new principal. Also, along with the Wallace Foundation work, is establishing the pipeline so that when somebody leaves, you have somebody willing to step in and ready to step in and to be effective right away. You know, whether they're at that school or at a similar school. And that gets to a third point, is looking at the fit of between the individual and the school. That's often overlooked. I mean, you can be a fantastic principal in one school and be just a disastrous principal in another school. And oftentimes districts don't really look at the fit. They'll place somebody in a position where they really shouldn't be. You have to put that person in the right position just to increase the odds that they're going to be successful.
Great, thank you.
If I could comment just briefly on that, I agree with everything Dr. Fuller has said. I would also say, we mentioned earlier when the panelists were talking before the webinar started about the decrease in teacher candidates. And part of that is because of the negative perception and the kinds of things that people say about education and about teachers. I think the same thing is true for principals. I think if we, as fellow principals, we need to talk about the positives of the job and all of the things. Even though it is a very difficult job, we're faced with tremendous challenges. It's also a job that brings tremendous joy and satisfaction in seeing the success of students and faculty and watching a school community grow. And so I think we need to, as principals and as principal organization, continue to talk about all the positives that being a principal brings to an individual instead of looking at the negatives. And that will encourage people to be willing to take the risk to become a school leader.
Great. Any last comments that you'd like to put in before we end today? We have a few more minutes. Caitlin?
No, I was just going to comment on, as David said, we were talking about the teacher shortage and the impact of that on the principal pipeline before we started this webinar, and I think that could probably be its whole separate webinar. But when Dr. Fuller, when Ed was sharing his slides around you know, the reasons contributing to principal turnover, I feel like a lot of that can be said around why we're seeing a shortage of teachers, right? Around the working environment, the conditions, low pay, you know, the kind of prestige of being a teacher is not as high as some other professions or what it used to be, right? So I think that there's some parallels that could be drawn there. But I also just wanted, you know, Jamon, to give you a chance to, any other advice that you would share with someone who has been in the principal role, and advice you would give to the districts or even the principal preparation programs, given your experiences?
Sure. I think as far as advice when it comes to the principal prep programs, it's just my personal belief that sometimes I think our new administrators need more than just 3 years of teaching experience. I can remember what it was like to be a teacher, and by my third year, I think I was just being comfortable with writing, you know, lesson plans and things of that nature. So we have to look at the type of profile that we have built for the next principals. And as far as the district level and things like that, I think a missed opportunity sometimes to recruit some great people is using your current principal staff. You know, oftentimes there's the HR people that go out and do some recruiting. Every now and then you may come across some school districts that utilizes their principals and that they have already been pre-identified. But I think oftentimes, sometimes in order to get the people that you need to use the people that you already have in order to recruit, because the principals the practicing principals are probably a little bit more familiar with what's expected. District office people is going to give you a different perspective of what they look for in principals, and then you have the principal acting principal or practicing principal is going to give you the real deal about what it's like to be a principal in that particular district or in that particular context. So I think we need to utilize the people that we have in order to get the people that's going to fit the vision and fit the mission of what the district has established. So don't shortchange those who are already in the midst of it. But also I agree with, I think Dr. Fuller made mention of how we need to be more selective in our principal prep program. Everybody shouldn't be a principal and assistant principal. Let's just be clear. I know that we need that in some places, definitely in as it relates to locale, have a more of a principal shortage than others. So just being more selective and not just accepting everybody for that. If that makes sense.
Great. Well, many thanks to everyone who's participated in today's webinar. I'd like to encourage our audience to please feel free to download today's presentations at the NAESP website at www.naesp.org. As always, if we can assist you in your professional learning journey, please let us know. Please contact us, and we hope that you'll join us for the next National Principals Month webinar on October 8th on Instructional Leadership, Creating Practice Out of Theory with Peter DeWitt. Thank you, everyone.